I've had to be this careful since before I joined the X-Men. I'll have to stay this careful till the day I die. For Jean's sake, as much as everyone else's, I have to stay strong, in control. Today on the Comic Book Report, the Uncanny X-Men Omnibus, Volume 2. Stick around and check it out. Greetings all, my name is Dominic and you're tuning in to the Comic Book Report, where we review comic books and graphic novels so you can get an idea of what to read. And today I am excited to be reviewing the Uncanny X-Men Omnibus Volume 2. It's all here, folks. Days of Futures Past, the Dark Phoenix Saga, and so much more. That's right, we're hitting some core moments from the Chris Claremont X-Men run. And I can't wait to talk about it, so let's get started with today's review. First, some quick facts about today's collection. The issues in this volume were written by Chris Claremont, and penciled primarily by Dave Cockrum and John Byrne. The issues in this volume were published by Marvel Comics beginning in 1980. The volume itself collects X-Men issues 132 through 141, X-Men Annual issues 4 and 5, Uncanny X-Men issues 142 through 153, Avengers Annual issues 10, Marvel Fanfare issues 1 through 4, Marvel Treasury Edition issues 26 and 27, Marvel Team Up issue 100, Bizarre Adventures issue 27, and Phoenix The Untold Story issue 1. This oversized hardcover comes in at 912 pages. At this time, I'd like to issue a general spoiler warning. I will be flipping through the contents of today's collection and commenting on plot points throughout. You've been advised. Okay, and here's our first look at that Uncanny X-Men Volume 2 Omnibus. Right from the jump, I love the cover art. I believe this is from issue 137, just a great image of Cyclops and Jean. Frankly, what's not to love? Next, I'll have us take a look at that spine, and yes, this is the newer version of the spine that has the nice little picture window and the smaller font. People will say what they will. I like the design of this spine. I just wish they were consistent because my omnibuses look a tad uneven on the shelves. And of course, as we segue onto the back cover of the book, we have all the little issues kind of thumbnailed on the back here. Love seeing it. There's some iconic issues here. Just your basic Marvel Omnibus dust jacket, no complaints. Frankly, this is one of my favorite X-Men omnibuses that I own. This is such a blast. So many fantastic issues inside. Okay, and now I'll give you a better look at that dust jacket again, and then we'll take a look under the hood at the under the dust jacket art. Because this is an older collection, you don't see as much under the dust jacket art as far as pizzazz. It's pretty straightforward, pretty similar to some of the Silver Age omnibuses I've noticed. After the dust jacket, of course, we have kind of the X-Men logo on the front and a nice X on the back here I'll show you. But yeah, no real complaints here, pretty standard fare for a Marvel omnibus. Really well put together. I always really like what Marvel does here. Like many of the Marvel omnibuses, this is an oversized hardcover with some nice glossy print pages. And now that we've properly handled a lot of the exterior work, I want to go ahead and take a second to show you the binding on this omnibus. It is sewn binding, and I have to say there's a pretty decent eye here. No real gutter loss. Luckily, a lot of these issues still have some nice panel layouts that leave some white spaces on the edge, so there's not too much creeping into that gutter, maybe a little bit, but overall, nothing really to complain about on that front. And now we're going to go ahead and jump right into the book itself. Have some great front matter here, title page, there's a table of contents, and some introduction, like little essays throughout the book. I'm assuming these are the essays from like the Marvel Masterworks and stuff like that, but little essays from the creators. Fans of omnibus editions, this is really just a fun feature to kind of get some perspective on some of the creators and what they thought about their time on the book. But yeah, jumping into the omnibus itself, wow, do we have some ground to cover today. I mentioned it briefly up front, but I think that this collection has some of the hardest hitters for the Chris Claremont classic X-Men run. I just see so much potential in this book. Things like Days of Futures Past and the Dark Phoenix Saga, of course. But I think some of the stuff that even stood out to me were also some of the more understated kind of works that don't get talked about as much, because of course I hear the big headlines for some of those stories, but there were some stories in here that I had never really encountered before, and they were almost as fun to read. You know, some of these little one-off adventures or 2 to 3 issue little story arcs, tons of fun in here. For those that don't know, Chris Claremont was the writer on this book. His run on X-Men spanned, late 70s through the 90s at least. He's kind of trickled back in and out since then, but that was the main chunk of his run. I did review the first omnibus for Uncanny X-Men, the beginning of the Chris Claremont run, on the channel already. I'll try to link a video for you to check it out if you're interested. And this picks up right where that one left off, which is heading directly into the Dark Phoenix saga. In Volume 1, we saw Jean Grey kind of sacrifice her life to save the rest of the X-Men as they came back to Earth from space. She gets exposed to this like cosmic radiation, the Phoenix Force, and she kind of comes back empowered as this being called the Phoenix. And she intermittently uses that power throughout the rest of Volume 1. But we start to see that there's a corruption aspect to the Phoenix, and she kind of becomes this dark Phoenix character, noted by kind of the red and gold costume. Anyway, the beginning of this run dives right into the Dark Phoenix saga, where we realize that she's being overcome by it, and she kind of poses a cosmic level threat to the universe. We have some of the Shi'ar Empire and, you know, all this crazy stuff. I think the Watcher shows up, but just anyway, things get pretty radical. X-Men are scrambling to try to save Jean's life and her soul when, you know, a lot of people are telling her that, you know, they have to execute her for the sake of the universe because she, you know, is inhabited by the Phoenix Force, which is this destructive force that can wreak havoc on the world and the universe. So that storyline unfolds in the first few issues of this collection, culminating with the kind of sacrificial death of Jean Grey, the Dark Phoenix. After that point, there's some really big transitions with the team. Cyclops is just kind of unable to continue as part of the X-Men and kind of leaves for a while, which is a pretty wild transition. After that, we have a couple more kind of interstitial issues, one including the Wendigo, which is a villain and someone who pops up in the Marvel Universe that I really enjoy seeing. And we also have a more prevalent, you know, set of appearances by Kitty Pryde as part of the X-Men now. She adds a lot of color to this roster. I think her youthfulness and kind of the mother-daughter sort of mentorship relationship between her and Storm. There's just really rich ground with Kitty Pryde. You can tell that Kitty's kind of the apple of Chris Claremont's eye, and we see her develop a lot as a character, even within this run. And it's not before too long that we actually, you know, hit upon the Days of Futures Past storyline. This is, I think, only 2 or 3 issues, which can be surprising to some who, you know that this is such an iconic story. But there's a lot of future hijinks where Kitty Pryde kind of gets her mind put into the body of her future self in this kind of crazy dystopian world in the future where a lot of the X-Men have been killed and mutants are being hunted and Sentinels are everywhere and the universe is just a total disaster. And it's kind of like their last stand to save mutant kind and humankind from like just this annihilating kind of future. And I think while she's in the future Kitty's kind of in the present, trying to stop this kind of political assassination or event from occurring that kicks off the Days of Futures Past kind of continuity and storyline. So there's some time travel shenanigans in here. For fans of the movie Days of Future Past, this is quite different than what you'll see on the big screen, but you can see that this was sort of the foundation and skeleton by which they built that movie. I personally like both stories quite a bit, but they are a bit different. That being said, it was so much fun to read. I think that this was actually the first time I've really read it all the way through. But I loved that story. I'm such a sucker for time travel, and I think it was handled pretty well. I don't know if it's paradoxical, but overall, like I said, just fantastic storytelling here. That and the Dark Phoenix saga are probably the most memorable stories in this whole collection, but for those that only buy this omnibus for those stories, you are going to be treated to so much more throughout this huge volume. A few stories I'd like to mention in this collection outside of those big 2. We have a pretty crazy Christmas issue where Kitty is basically home alone in the X-Men mansion, and there's some kind of creepy alien entity stalking her and trying to kill her. and she has to basically survive, try to like flush it out of the system, and kind of just, save the day by herself. This is a really tense, kind of suspenseful, almost horror issue, which is so fun to see as a Christmas issue. I was so struck by this. The art is gorgeous. The alien is creepy and menacing, and how she ultimately saves the day and extinguishes the enemy. It's just a lot of fun. So for those that haven't read it, I highly recommend that issue. We also have a pretty just wild one with Doctor Doom and Storm. That issue and story arc kind of bring out this more negative side of Storm's nature. In the past, we've kind of seen her as almost this benevolent entity that kind of has her ties to the earth, and she's Storm, but she has this kind of loving earth power, green happiness aura about her. And these stories really flesh out the kind of more powerful kind of Storm nature of her personality as well. She actually ascends into this kind of weird dark form in this story arc. Anyway, it's pretty wild. We start to see a lot more character development from Storm at this point and moving forward. She goes through some stuff. She has to basically decide who she wants to be, the girl that was in Africa or this new X-Men, and does she want to be either of those? What does that mean for her? And I think that if Kitty Pryde is the apple of Chris Claremont's eye, I would almost wager that Storm undergoes the most character development. She's the most maybe interesting character for a lot of this early Chris Claremont run, at least I'd wager. That story arc also includes Arcade and another Murder World situation. Arcade was a villain that I did not really know much about in the Marvel Universe until I started reading the Chris Claremont run. He shows up every so often, and he kind of builds these elaborate, they're called Murder Worlds, but they're these elaborate, I don't even know how to describe them. They're kind of labyrinthian, creepy places. Sometimes he has androids or things to kind of destroy the X-Men. Anyway, he's a super unique villain, and I always like the issues he pops up in. I think that he is underutilized. I'd love to see him adapted in some way on the big screen as well. We also have a few issues of Marvel fanfare in this omnibus that have a story that heavily involves Sauron, the kind of pterodactyl man, which of course brings us back to the Savage Land. This story, from what I remember reading, was a lot of fun. I think Sauron's a particularly interesting kind of villain / misunderstood character, and I really liked, what I read of that. We also have some like black and white issues towards the back of this omnibus. We have a really interesting one with Jean Grey and I think her sister and sort of this underwater world, as well as a Nightcrawler feature that has him traveling to some kind of parallel universe. This is also built upon later in Chris Claremont's run with a kind of sequel almost for that Nightcrawler story. Both stories are terrific. I had never really read these before, and even though they're in black and white, they're a whole lot of fun. Also have that Phoenix Untold story right at the end. It's kind of fun. It's almost like an epilogue. If you start this omnibus with the death of the Phoenix, having the Untold story at the end is really a great bookend where you can have this collection start and end with Jean, and like I said, a very good cap on the collection as a whole. As far as the writing itself goes, I think Chris Claremont is really kicking it into the next gear with this collection. Volume 1 was fine, but I think he's really starting to find his voice as an X-Men writer. Like I said, some of his most prolific classic stories are in this run. That being said, there's definitely some good character development here, but I think that is even further overhauled as we get into Omnibus Volumes 3 and 4, particularly with the characters of Storm and Kitty Pryde and Wolverine. We just certainly see a ton of development with those characters. You see inklings of that in this volume, but wow, it just kicks into overdrive in those next couple volumes. But there's not a ton of flops in this. You're still at kind of an interesting time at the very early 80s. We're just kind of cresting into that 80s and 90s X-Men boom where this was just everywhere and you have all the spin-off books, but we're just kind of reaching that point. Claremont's just really getting his roots in, I would say, but it's not as all over the place as Volume 1 could sometimes feel like. It's definitely starting to get a little more just better paced, a little more nailed down. We have a couple, multiple issue story arcs in here, and he's really starting to manage a lot of those subplots he started developing even in Volume 1. And that's something I think Chris Claremont's almost a master of, is that sometimes there'll be like a panel or two that sets up a subplot and narrative thread he pays off 10, 20 issues later, or you'll build, and it just always feels like there's several subplots going on all at the same time. We definitely see that seeded throughout this collection, and as I mentioned, of course, further develop as you get going in these subsequent volumes. Artistically, with both Cockrum and Byrne, the art in this collection is really hard to beat for me. I think that it's so much more fine-tuned compared to Volume 1, and it's just looking beautiful. I feel like the character models are also distinct. The coloring is absolutely vibrant in this reprint, and I just think the designs and the layouts are always fresh, they're captivating, and I just love the art. I mean, how do you beat John Byrne, especially in the 80s? And David Cockrum is just, going full force here, guys. The art is absolutely stunning. I would really say before this year, I was really a casual X-Men fan, especially as far as the comic book goes. The beginning of the year is when I really started reading the Chris Claremont run from the very beginning in earnest to see how far I can go and get. Right now, I'm somewhere in the middle of Mutant Massacre. I've jumped around a little bit, and obviously I've read a lot more modern X-Men and, different runs here and there. But this is the year I really dove into X-Men proper, primarily in the Claremont era of X-Men, debatably the most iconic era of X-Men, and it's been an absolute treat. I think I enjoyed the contents of Volume 1, especially where that first Claremont team is sort of established, and obviously reading the giant-sized issue, just such an iconic, comic book in the history of comics. But Volume 2, this is when I really got invested in the X-Men. This is where I really felt like I could also put my roots down and really sink into these characters. And like I said, while some of the most iconic storylines are maybe in this book, I think it's really the characters and my engagement with them, and even Volumes 3 and 4, that are even more strong. I almost prefer some of those latter volumes just because at that point the characters are even more layered. They're going through some stuff, and I've had such a rich history with them having read all of these volumes. I think that this is absolutely a must-read collection for X-Men fans. If you haven't read some of these issues like I hadn't before this year, highly recommend it. This collection also made me like Cyclops quite a bit more. I always have been back and forth with Cyclops. Overall, I net out really liking the character, but sometimes I get sick of him, or whatever. But to see how he deals with Jean's death, and, he leaves the team, but whenever we see his appearances after that, I was kind of fascinated in kind of the backwash of his grieving process and how he moves on and how he walks through it. I found some of those issues some of the most eye-opening and just intriguing for his character. I actually haven't read the early kind of Stan Lee, Roy Thomas era of X-Men way back when. I got those omnibuses ordered though, so I'm hoping to dive in. I understand that those are not some of the best X-Men runs, but I'm wondering if I go back and read them, if I will feel even more tied to characters like Cyclops and Jean, even more so than, just starting with the Claremont era. Those first 5 X-Men plus Professor X, I do like them. I've obviously read them in so many different, runs, not even just Claremont, but beyond that into modern. But I've never really read those foundational issues, and I'm very curious to see how that shines a light on the character interactions moving forward. But even without that base, even with what we get from Claremont, Cyclops is interesting, and I think from this point on, he becomes even more interesting to me. I don't always agree with how he handles the women in his life, let's say, how he moves on to Jean, to other people I'm kind of suspect about, particularly Madeline Pryor, but that's for another day. Right now, I'll have to say that the issues and appearances in this book, really just interesting. I really liked it. Like I said, Cyclops is a lot of fun. We also get some incredible villains. I already mentioned things like Days of Futures Past, the Sentinels. You got arguably Dark Phoenix herself. You got the Wendigo. You got Doctor Doom. You have Arcade. And of course, you even have an appearance or two from Magneto. I wouldn't say that this volume has some of Magneto's most brilliant moments. I think some of the subsequent collections have some of my favorite I've read of him personally. But you can't have a huge X-Men collection without Magneto. I mean, what are you missing out on if you don't have Magneto? You have all that and so much more. And there's a little bit of something here for everyone. I like that a lot lot of the stories are at least a couple issues long, but you do have a couple one-offs here and there. Like I said, you have some X-Men annuals and Avengers annual. You have those Marvel fanfares, the Phoenix Lost stories, etc. And it's kind of nice in collections like this that you don't just have the numerical X-Men title or Uncanny X-Men title. You have some of those annuals. You have some of those special, stories or issues that they throw in here. It just makes the volumes feel a little bit more comprehensive. It makes me feel like I'm getting a little bit more. When I buy an X-Men collection and they throw in Marvel fanfare, they throw in the Untold Stories, they throw in... I just really like when Marvel does that. I really appreciate when they map books kind of holistically and inclusive of so many of the other things that are happening involving our favorite Merry Mutants. And on top of all of that, we have a healthy amount of extras at the back. We have sketches. We have a ton of covers. We have covers from the reprints. We have just so much bonus material here. I love seeing it, especially with a volume like this. And that brings this volume to a close. All that's left now is to give this collection a grade. It should come as no surprise with the art as dialed in as this, and including some of the most iconic X-Men storylines ever written, that the Comic Book Report is happy to give the Uncanny X-Men Omnibus Volume 2 by Chris Claremont an A. If you have an opportunity to pick up this volume, or volumes that contain this issue, or even to read it digitally, or in whatever form you collect comics, do it. Make the jump. This is a must-read for all X-Men fans, and for fans of comics in general. This is an important snapshot in the history of all comic books. And there's a reason for that. Do yourself a favor and check it out. And thank you so much for watching. This has been the Comic Book Report. Until next time, please don't forget to leave a like and a comment, and I'll see you next time. Have a good one.